Well, well, looks like there's finally some good news on the forefront of American foreign policy. Apparently, though this doesn't seem to be covered in the media at all, there may be, within the next year or so, an end to the war in Afghanistan. Zalmay Khalilzad, who is a special representative of the president negotiating directly with the Taliban, has apparently reached a non-binding framework for a future deal to end the war against the Taliban and to achieve some kind of a peace settlement. Now, the reason why I've been kind of hopeful about this peace process and these rounds of negotiations led by Khalilzad is that this is not being done through the bureaucracy of the State Department, which, never really would want to see any sort of an end to the war in Afghanistan. This is going directly through the president to this negotiator, Mr. Khalilzad. So there's nowhere for Mike Pompeo, who certainly would favor a continued war in Afghanistan, to sort of muck things up by misrepresenting the president's wishes and being a little more combative with the Afghans than he might like. Khalilzad now has to report directly to President Trump, who ostensibly wants to end the war in Afghanistan, at least based on everything he said publicly. Now, Khalilzad's an interesting choice because you might have guessed by his name, he is not a waspy, your typical waspy Republican. He is a Republican neoconservative, which is quite interesting, that he would be picked to negotiate the peace. But he seems to come to the realization, even from his perspective, that the war in Afghanistan really is getting us nowhere. And he is, interestingly enough, I believe, if not born in Afghanistan, he's at least of Afghan descent, and I'm pretty sure he speaks their language. I forget. There's a lot of languages in Afghanistan, but I believe he speaks Pashto. So he should be able to speak to the Taliban without a translator on his own, sort of as a sort of a cousin, you could say, because he's not exactly a brother of theirs, because he's certainly not a member of the Taliban. He is very much an American. He is, a hawkish, Republican intellectual. He is someone who you would think would be, one of the most pro-war people and combative people in America. However, it would seem that in this case he has come around to the side of peace, and that's really just one of the many reasons why I shouldn't say surprised, but disappointed that this story isn't being covered more in the media, because it really is a remarkable story, the people involved, and where we are in history and what's about to happen. I mean, it would be remarkable to see an end to the longest war in American history by far, especially considering that no ground has been gained in the 18 years that the U.S. has been fighting in Afghanistan. The Taliban still controls the same areas that they've always controlled for as long as they've been around. They control the areas where their people are the ethnic majority. And so here are the terms of the deal. It's pretty simple. Primarily, the Taliban will commit to fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS after the U.S. leaves, which shouldn't be much of a problem, considering that the Taliban pretty much have been willing to do that since the war in Afghanistan started. They would much rather, have to deal with Al-Qaeda than have to deal with the United States. They wouldn't have wanted to fight this 18-year war to protect Al-Qaeda. They were fighting this 18-year war, for their own independence. So that's a pretty easy term for the Taliban to meet. And then the second one is a little more difficult for the Taliban to swallow, and that's negotiating with the Afghan government, which is backed by the U.S. That government was formed out of the so-called Northern Alliance, which is essentially just all of the non-Pashto ethnicities. They had to sort of unite together for strength purposes, because the Pashtuns are such a large plurality of the population. I believe about 40% of the country's Pashtun and 60% are other ethnicities. That 60% is made up in this government. Well, basically, the Taliban have never considered that government to be legitimate. They consider them to be American puppets, which, to a certain extent, they pretty much are, because they don't really have much democracy in Afghanistan. It's not a place where democracy is ever going to work. And they are a U.S. protectorate. And if the U.S. support for the Afghan government went away, they'd disappear in a matter of hours rather than days. So it'll be interesting to see if the Taliban even get anywhere with those folks, because so far they haven't been willing to discuss anything with that government. They've only wanted to talk directly to the U.S. because they see correctly that the U.S. Are the folks in charge in Afghanistan, even in the parts, in the parts that the Taliban doesn't control. They see the U.S. as the people they're fighting. They're not fighting any so-called Afghan government. Those are just allies of the U.S. in Afghanistan, as far as they see it. Now, this deal has not been finalized yet, this Framework 4 deal, but apparently it's supposed to be signed and finalized by September 1st, which means that I guess after that the Taliban will begin speaking and negotiating with the current Afghan government on some kind of a power-sharing agreement, which, really, what would be best for Afghanistan is if you could just have the Taliban in the areas that they already control, keep control of those, and then let the folks outside of the Pashto majority areas be a part of this other government. And it could be, you could have one flag or whatever you want and make it like Bosnia, to where essentially you have two states within one set of borders, if you really don't want to break up the country, but, you're not going to make this some united country like France or something with a unitary parliamentary republic. That's ridiculous, and that's what the U.S. has tried to set up, and I don't know why, because anyone with a brain could see that that's not going to work unless you're a total ideologue who, says, oh, we have to overcome nationalism and we just have to all work together. It's like, no, you're not going to have people who speak 14 different languages, share a government, and then when they lose the election consider that the leader is legitimate or something. I certainly wouldn't. If some French or Italian guy came and started shouting in my face and saying, I am your president, you have to listen to me, blah, 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 oui, oui, he'd get smacked in the mouth. So I'm pretty optimistic, and I don't say this often, but I think that things have a great potential for getting better in Afghanistan. It won't be pretty when the U.S. pulls out. Things will not go well, but at least something can change after that, because the way things currently are, it's a sequence of endless bloodletting. And sure, there will be blood after the U.S. leaves, but there's been blood for 18 years. I don't think that'll change. Really, you need the Afghans. If they're going to fight, they need to burn each other out, and really let all that kindling flare up for a bit. But it should calm down after that if you just leave people to their own devices. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.